Hello, YouTube. My name is Alan, and it's that time once again. Let's talk metal. The topic for this particular episode is looking at the question of whether or not metal has gotten itself kind of stuck. That as a genre, it's not really moving forward or changing very much. And if anything, it's gotten itself kind of stuck in a retro habit where it's just redoing things that it's already done. You might say that it's treading water or stuck in stasis. Some people might say it's stagnating, whatever phrase you want to use here. Just the idea that heavy metal's not moving forward a ton anymore. This question's been rattling around in the back of my brain for a while. And to be clear, I'm not the only person to have this thought. It's been discussed on some different content that's been put up over on the Hate Meditations YouTube channel, which also has a blog that goes along with it. Uh, it's come up in the context of, let's see, a video Metal Mickey made recently where he talked about a lot of newer bands and albums sounding and looking very much the same. And it's come up, on Heavy Metallurgy sometimes, where Marty and I joke about these bands that have kind of the standard nuclear blast contract, where they get a, offer from a label to, sort of, come back, you're a veteran band. Hey, why don't you just make the same basic album that fans want, and keep doing that, and we'll give you a contract. So yeah, it's all been knocking around. And I think one of the things that's kind of pushed it to the fore a little bit lately is that this year we have seen several bigger name veteran heavy metal bands coming out with new albums that, yeah, at least on first pass, aren't really breaking any new ground whatsoever. You know, a little earlier this year, Destruction came out with a new album, and while it's not bad, is it really that different from the last couple of Destruction albums? No, not really. We've got a new Halloween album earlier this year. Does it really break any new ground for Halloween? No. Is it, a new timeless classic? I and many fans don't think so. No problem to those fans who do really like that album, but it's not taking Halloween in any direction that Halloween's never been before. We're about to have a New Testament drop at the time of this recording. You know, Testament's kind of the poster child for the standard nuclear blast contract joke. They've been on the label for about 20 years. They've made several albums. They're all pretty good, but they're all pretty similar as well. And difference in lineup here, slightly different production there, but there's nothing majorly different about these, and they all kind of harken back to Testament's, original glory days in the late 80s and earliest 90s. So, yeah, kind of just more of the same. There's a new Creator due out. I think that may not be coming out until January 26th, but there's already at least one single out. And is anybody really expecting it to sound any different from the last several Creator albums? I mean, folks might enjoy it. And again, not trying to take anything away from that. The point is, these bands, like metal overall, feel like they are kind of stuck, that they're just not really moving forward a whole lot. And yes, I know there are plenty of bands that are out there pushing the envelope here and there, whether it's Gall's Weird or Hail Spirit Noir. Sure, I know, yes, they are out there. But it feels like those are fewer and farther between than it sometimes in the past. And it feels like they have a really hard time getting much recognition or traction these days. One thing that stands out to me too about all of this is that it's very different from how heavy metal evolved during the 20th century. Very quick, let's look at the timeline super fast. Heavy metal in the 1970s. You've got Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin doing, this, very heavy hard rock, acid rock stuff. But by 1980, that sound was ancient history, and the new wave of British heavy metal rewrote the rules of what heavy metal was going to sound like. And you had a new wave of British bands and a new wave of American bands like the Rods, who were the new face of a very different sounding heavy metal. But within 5 years, bands like the Rods were considered past their prime. That's kind of over the hill. By the mid 80s, it's, thrash metal rising up. It's thrash's time to shine, in parallel with glam metal as well. Like it or not, this became a big thing. But by, the earliest 90s, both thrash and glam were all but extinct while death metal reigned supreme. And this had become the big thing. But by 95, people were sick of death metal. It was on the decline, and black metal was the thing. That was the focus. By 2000, the black metal scene was pretty saturated, and new metal had reared its head. I don't have a new metal CD at all to show here, so the visuals are over. Sorry about that. And then by, 2005, metalcore and some of these different core genres, that became the new branch on the heavy metal tree. Some of those genres you might not care for a whole lot, but they all were sort of new, bigger, different sounds. They all defined a new genre under the umbrella of heavy metal. But now, what happens after 2005? I mean, what are the movements that really define heavy metal after that? All the time periods we just went through could be defined by certain styles and certain bands. You think 1980s, you think late 80s, you're thinking thrash and glam. You think early 80s, yeah, you're thinking more like, Riot and Twisted Swister and Quiet Riot, maybe. You think, 1990, 91, you're thinking Scott Burns and death metal and Cannibal Corpse. What are you thinking for the late 2000s? What new heavy metal sound defines the 2010s or the 2020s? I'm kind of at a loss. Now, to be clear, I don't know everything. If there's some big metal movement that I'm either just blanking on or have completely overlooked and just never got on my radar, by all means, leave a comment down below. Fill in the blank here for sure. But you see, when I'm thinking of these past 20 years of heavy metal, what I'm coming up with are not new branches on the heavy metal family tree. I'm coming up with retro movements. In the late 2000s, new wave of traditional heavy metal started to become a thing. That's a fun movement. I like a lot of bands in that style, but it's not a new style. The whole point of new wave of traditional heavy metal is to sound like you're from 1983 and look like you're from 1983. Then, of course, by the early 2010s, you've got a boom in old school death metal. But that's not a new branch on the family tree either. That's a retro movement. The whole point of that is to look and sound like you're from about 1993. Then there's, all these new black metal bands all over the place. But they're not really adding new styles or branches either right now. Many of them are just trying to look and sound like they're from Scandinavia in the mid 90s. And then there's thrash. Thrash has tried to have several revival movements during the 21st century. Every few years, it feels like someone's making a big thing about, oh, the new retro thrash movement. I don't think any of them have been particularly successful. Yes, there are some good thrash bands from the 21st century and some good thrash albums from recent years. But many of the thrash bands in the 21st century, they're just trying to sound like 80s thrash. Again, it's more a retro movement, not a new breed of innovative thrash. Thrash, I think, had a particularly rough go of it here. Compared to some of the other genres, thrash got itself painted into a corner a bit. It never proliferated into as many subgenres as death metal and black metal did. People can joke about subgenres all the time. And yes, I know the names and terms get kind of annoying, but they do highlight the fact that death metal and black metal did find a lot of different ways to tinker with those sounds. Thrash metal always had some trouble tinkering with the thrash metal formula. You had different regional scenes. German thrash sounds a bit different from East Coast thrash, and that sounds a bit different from Bay Area thrash. And beyond that, pizza thrash isn't really a style. Crossover is, well, just what it says. It's just blending in hardcore. There's not a million different styles of thrash. Blackened thrash from recent years is kind of just black metal, harsh, extreme vocals on top of a very standard sounding, thrashy template. Yeah, there was tech thrash, but tech thrash points to one of the, problems. That was something where thrash did try to evolve and innovate and go in a different direction, but it quickly became a dead end because fans weren't really into it. And so it never really gained a ton of popularity. It has its following. Yes, I know. I like a lot of tech thrash albums, but let's be honest, it's a very, very small subset. It doesn't have a huge fandom. It just doesn't. So, yeah, that's kind of the issue. These genres, get revisited and they're not being expanded as much as they used to. Some of that is okay to a certain extent. There's nothing wrong with that inherently. If, some bands here and there are, kind of doing the tribute thing, okay, that can be fun. But when lots of bands are doing it, then it kind of starts to feel like your genre is getting clogged up. And that's kind of what I feel like heavy metal has gotten itself into. And part of that is, not only do you have new bands who are quite content to just reinvent old sounds and be like, yeah, we play old school death metal and we sound exactly like we're from 1992, even though it's 30 years later. You also have all those veteran bands that are still active on the scene, and they're still trying to sound like they're from 1992 also, like with all the, different, Destruction and Creator and Testament albums that I showed a little earlier. And then it's like, well, how could anything move forward if everybody's so focused on this retro sound? The old stuff is taking up so much bandwidth that it's really hard for anything new or different to push through. This isn't a problem unique to heavy metal. Lots of different aspects of culture and pop culture. I think that, they are a little bit stuck in this retro cycle in recent years. I've always noticed a strong parallel between heavy metal's issue with this and professional wrestling's problem with it. Pro wrestling is something I used to keep up with a fair amount, and an issue they've had for a long time now, going back even into like the mid and late 90s, is that you need to develop new young talent to become the next generation of superstars to keep the whole thing going. But that's really hard to do when all the old talent is still on the payroll and they're going to eat up a lot of the attention. They're going to get a lot of the big matches and a lot of the ring time and a lot of the TV time. And that means the new players don't get much exposure. It's, the older wrestlers are past their prime. Physically, they cannot move the way they could have 10, 20, 30 plus years ago for some of them. But they're still there. They are still a draw, and we'll come back to that point here in just a bit. Fans still want to see them and will pay to see them, so they're still there, but it makes it feel like it's all just the same stuff. It's like, I feel like, I could tune in and watch The Rock and The Undertaker fight sometime this week. Those guys were fighting each other, what, 30 years ago? Well, why do I need to see them fight again? You're watching a wrestling match and you're like, you don't even know what year it is, except by, how much gray hair some of them have. Metal feels like it's got sort of that same issue. Um, and it kind of ties into issues with branding there a little bit. I don't like the word branding. I don't think many people do. But it is a thing here that why is this whole thing happening? Part of it is branding. Fans recognize those older veteran names, those, whether it's a pro wrestler or whether it's a band logo, folks will recognize that. Yes, oh, Testament. I know Testament. I remember Testament. I have fond memories of Testament. I will buy another Testament album. Destruction? Yes, I remember Destruction. I loved listening to Destruction. I will buy another Destruction album. But you show them a logo from some new band that they probably haven't heard anything by, and it's just like, I don't know. It looks kind of cool, but I don't know. Do I really want to spend my money on that? I'm not really familiar with them. And so, yeah, there becomes, a financial issue from the consumer side where consumers don't really want to gravitate towards newer things. They gravitate towards older things. It's the whole reason brand names do so well. Studies have shown time and time again for all kinds of different products, most people will gravitate towards the name brand over a brand they don't recognize. Uh, Bands understand this. It's why bands tend to keep their name and keep their logo. A lot of times there's calls by fans like, "Oh, you should guys should just, change your name or change your logo and stuff." No, they ain't going to do that because they realize that would be giving up a big part of their image that people identify with that helps them sell records and helps them sell tickets. Labels recognize this too. Yeah, again, I think, it's easy. Some people want to blame the record labels for putting all this stuff out that just sounds the same. Well, they're putting it out because they know it sells. When they try to put out things that maybe are more cutting edge or innovative or daring, they're taking a risk because that can divide a fan base and it may not go over nearly as well. And there are plenty of examples to back that up. When Cynic's Focus came out, that album crashed and burned. Nobody wanted it. Today, it's considered a classic by many people, but that's 35 years after the fact or something around there. When stuff like Atheist, was coming out with unquestionable presence and elements, a lot of people were just scratching their heads and not buying it. Anacrusis always sounded a lot more innovative and different from other thrash bands, and they're not part of the big four. Anacrusis is not part of the big four, the big eight, the big 12, the big 16, the big 20. Not even close to the top of the list. Great band, lots of fans over time, but it never translated into sales. Believer made a very innovative tech album with Dimensions, and pretty soon after that they broke up because nobody was that interested. Pestilence, it's not just, thrash, death metal bands do this kind of stuff. Pestilence tried to make something very jazzy and innovative with spheres, and pretty soon after this came out, they did the same thing Believer did, and I had to go on hiatus. Even more recently, think about, how much, flack bands caught, like Tomb Mold for changing their sound some on this album, and Blood Incantation for adding Pink Floyd-like elements into their death metal on this album. Yes, those albums got a lot of hype and a lot of praise from part of the fan base, but the other part of the fan base threw a shit fit and didn't want anything to do with those albums. If you're thinking in terms of like the band needs to make money selling records and merch and tickets, and the label needs to make money for those same kind of things, uh, did Blood Incantation make more money doing this, or would they have made more money doing like a Starspawn Part 2, The Return of Starspawn? Yeah, somebody, is going to think about that. Again, I think in Blood Incantation and Two Mold's case, I think these albums did well enough that they can justify pushing in that direction. And the artists are happy going in that direction, that's great. But if these albums had flopped, not sold very much, and only gotten very mid reviews from most people, well, the bands and labels would have to rethink, do we keep trying to, change and advance here? What about doing Starspawn Part 2? Hey, 15th anniversary, Return of Starspawn. Just throwing it out there. It probably would do better. The artist and the label do have to make money on these things. Hate Meditation's website, kind of, will go into the financial and economic side of this kind of argument more. It's not my specialty. I'm not going to go there. But yeah, I mean, it is a consideration. The bands can't live on nothing, and neither can the record labels can't exist if they're not generating enough income. I do think it's also easy for a lot of people to overestimate how much bands and labels make. Sure, if you're Metallica or you're on one of the few really giant record labels, you might have $1 million contract and be making crazy money on tour. I doubt any band that I've shown CDs by in this video, I doubt any of them generate enough money that the members can all quit their day jobs and just live off of music revenue. I could be wrong, but I'd be surprised. Again, the Metallicas and AC/DCs of the world, those are the very, very rare exceptions. In heavy metal, even if you're a relatively well-known band, once the tour is over, you go back to your day job. You have to in order to make ends meet. So why is this? Why does it seem like so many people are willing to, buy the relatively generic kind of same sounding albums? And again, I want to be real clear. I'm not trying to piss on anybody who enjoys this kind of stuff. As I've shown, I've got a fair amount of it myself and I enjoy it. That's fine. But why does that seem to be like the most popular thing that sells the best and encourages bands to keep making similar albums and labels to keep making similar albums? I think part of it is, again, just the nostalgia factor. A big part of the record buying heavy metal fan base, they are middle aged now. It's my generation, folks that are like a half generation older than me and maybe like a, little bit younger than me also. They're the ones that are buying a lot of the physical product. We're all in that middle aged thing where on one level or another, you're dealing with your midlife crisis. It doesn't have to be as overt as running out and, getting hair implants and buying a Ferrari. A lot of times it's just the little stuff. You're dealing with the pressures of day-to-day life, trying to make ends meet, provide for a family, deal with a job that you may or may not still enjoy, and also, you're more worried about future expenses and stuff. It's like, am I ever going to be able to save enough to retire and not have to keep doing this same job? Heck, if I can barely make ends meet this month, how do I plan for that? Middle age, you also deal with, more sort of, limitations come up on what you can do physically. You start to run into more health problems. And you start having to deal with, loss more. Your parents' generation are older and passing away. Friends may pass away early. People that you looked up to as a kid, pass away. Every other week you see, some celebrity pass away. It's like, oh, I remember them as a kid. And overall, it generates a certain stress and sadness. And one, understandable response to that is to like, I just kind of want to get away from all that stress and go to my, quote unquote happy place. When was I happy? I was happy when I was 19, back in the good old days. Flip hamburgers for a few hours, make enough money for a tank of gas and a new metal cassette, and I could just drive around town, cruise around with a friend or two, and listen to heavy metal. So when we want that classic sound. We want a Testament album that sounds like a Testament album. We don't want demonic. Demonic doesn't sound like the Testament we remember. Uh, we want a Creator album that sounds like Creator. We don't want Creator to do something completely different. We want a Destruction album that sounds like the classic Destruction albums, not the least successful human cannonball or some other weird new direction for Destruction to try that's just like, wow, that doesn't really sound like the Destruction I remember. Those kind of things, older fans, long-term fans, it's easy for us to, I think, to get kind of jaded on these things. We get a bit set in our ways, and it's like, yeah, I want my Destruction to sound like Destruction. I don't want it to suddenly sound like, oh, Destruction's trying out this new, uh, you know, electric power violence thing worked into their sound. I don't want my creator to go into, grindcore. And that's reinforcing the idea then that, okay, if I'm going to buy your record, you better give me what I want. And then there's a pressure on the band and the label to give the fan what they want. We need to make money for these entities. Well, then we have to kind of stay in place. We have to keep remaking the same thing. Again, it's not really blaming the fans either for this. Like I said, it's understandable why people want that nostalgia and why they just kind of, adhere to that classic sound. It's what they recognize, it's what they have fond memories attached to. And in a stressful world, yeah, sometimes you just want that 56 minutes of listening to something and be like, yeah, that sounds close enough to the Destruction I like. I want to spend a few of my dollars and get a fun new Destruction record. And it's not going to sound exactly as good as their old ones, but it will kind of push the nostalgia button in my brain and let me enjoy the next 56 minutes of reminiscing about Destruction. Where does that leave things as a genre? Well, leaves you with, where you're a bit stuck. And how do you get out of that? I don't know. I don't have the answers to this. I do want to make the point that it's not just metal that has this. As I mentioned before, it's a problem with wrestling. It's a problem with lots of things. People gravitate towards the name brands, and a lot of times people just, will often gravitate towards the same option. And this, of course, doesn't apply to everyone. There are plenty of heavy metal fans out there that avoid the samey sounding stuff, that they want the cutting edge. They'll dig around and find the unusual, the strange, the weird, the radical. They'll do the research, the radical research. Yes, radical research is a good example of that. They're not going to talk about the next Testament record. They're going to talk about the next Hail Spirit Noir record because that's going to be something completely different than what that band has done before and maybe what any band has done before. Some folks won't like it, some folks will. So, yeah, fans want different things, but when you're looking at the big picture, a lot of people, many fans are going to gravitate towards wanting that name brand. They're going to gravitate towards wanting that classic sound. Companies and bands, they're going to do that research. They're going to figure that out. And if they want to sell a lot of product, that's what they've got to deliver. Wrap up here maybe with a consumer fact that I read years ago, and it surprised me, but it also explained something I had noticed. I noticed whenever you drive past or visit car dealerships, they always have a ton of white vehicles. And nothing wrong with that, but it just always stood out to me because personally, just for me, I always thought that, if I could afford a brand new vehicle, I would, and I got to pick the color, I'd pick any color but white. To me, it just seemed like, the most vanilla, plain colors. Like I'd pick black or red or a cool blue. I don't know. White would be way down the list. But according to consumer data, every year in the US, year after year after year after year, the most popular color by far among new car sales is white. So it doesn't matter that I'm the outlier who doesn't want white because I'm the outlier. Companies have figured out that most car buyers want a white vehicle. So they make more white vehicles and dealerships stock more white vehicles because that's what's going to sell the best. And sure, there's going to be people like me that come on and be like, can I have that in black, please, instead? Yeah, okay, we'll find a way to probably make that work. But they don't need to keep a lot of those other colors around because there's not as much demand for them. So that is my take on where heavy metal seems to have gotten itself and why it's gotten there. I'm not saying, it's the end of the world or anything. There's tons of good metal albums that come out every year, and lots of things I enjoy, lots of things that do sound different and unique. But it does feel to me that overall metal just doesn't have those big defining movements, those new genres popping up the way it did for so very long. But hey, let's talk about it in the comments down below. Am I completely off base here? If so, feel free to say so. I may have missed some big movements. I can't listen to everything. Maybe there's an entire new genre out there built around, spirit box and ginger, the whole djent thing. I think that is more just like a particular, rhythm style. Maybe it's a whole new branch on the metal family tree that I'm just not familiar with. If so, leave a comment. That's awesome. Uh, do you feel like a lot of these bands are just stuck making the same album? Are you good with that? Do you still find a lot of enjoyment in those albums? If so, that's great. Would you prefer to see more of these bands try to branch out and push the envelope a little bit more? I don't think it's fair to expect them to sound exactly like they did 40 years ago. Like people are going to say about when the new creator comes out, some people are inevitably going to say, oh, it's no pleasure to kill. Of course it's not. It's 40 years later. Do you really expect them to sound exactly like they did when they were like 19 and 20? It's impossible. Maybe they can come kind of close, but it's not going to be exactly the same. Is that a huge deal breaker? Is that why you steer clear of this stuff? Or are you okay with it? And you're like, yeah, it's fine for what it is. Leave a comment down below. Let me know what you think about some of this weird mess that I've dredged up here. All right, that will do it. Until next time, everybody, please take care. And as always, keep banging your head.